He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before him. So open up the gates, make way before the King of Kings. The God, sing it out. The God who comes to save is here to set the captives free. But who can stop the Lord Almighty? Sing it out. Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's rolling with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before him. Whoa. Yeah. Sing it out. Who can stop? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord? Sing it over the battle. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? There is no one who can stop the Lord Almighty. Who can stop the Lord? See that? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before him. We will bow to God.
Go ahead and have a seat. That song is a powerful reminder of what we heard last weekend, Good Friday and Easter Sunday, that God sent his son Jesus to die on a cross for the forgiveness of our sins, and then he rose again. And this song reminds us not only that, but that he is all-powerful. He is here to fight our battles for us. He is unstoppable. And why that's so important is because as we kick off a new series today, we need to know that God is with us as we ride the storm. So mentioning Good Friday, Easter Sunday, I just want to celebrate with you because I know many of you invited guests to come. We had over 10,000 people here last week, and just at the Troy campus, over 25,000 people across all Kensington campuses for our weekend services. Thank you for doing that. It's awesome. And if you're someone who just came for the first time last weekend and you came back today, I want you to know we're really glad that you're back here. We design our services with you in mind. My name's Nancy. I'm on the campus team, and recently I was out in the lobby talking to a young woman named Gina. And Gina shared with me that she feels called by God to help out at a health clinic to meet the needs of those less fortunate. Now, if you're someone like Gina and you know what your gifts, talents, and abilities are and you're looking to make a difference, or if you're just trying to figure out what are your gifts, talents, and abilities, then the Move Out Conference coming up in a few weeks here is for you. Let's watch this video together and we'll catch the vision for it.
So if you're at all like me, maybe you like coming down to Detroit's Eastern Market to grab some farm fresh food, hang out with some friends, check out the local art scene, and just soak up the culture of the city. But what if we're able to see a place like this as more than just a fun spot to hang? What if we actually saw this as the church? So there's a good chance, if you're watching this right now, that there's a place just like this in your own life where God's already working and He's calling you to join Him. It could be at where you work. It could be in your local school. It could be at your kids' sporting events. It could be anywhere. Dude, this is really good, man.
Thank you.
So on April 20th and 21st, we're hosting the Move Out Conference at the Troy campus. This conference has got one idea in mind, to connect you to God's calling on your life. We're going to help you develop a plan and see you move out in action, becoming the church, loving and serving the people that God has placed all around you. Coming here from author, speaker, and pastor of New Song Church in California, Dave Gibbons.
What would the church look like if it's not contained on a piece of land?
The CEO of the New York City Rescue Mission, Craig Mays.
If there's a child that is homeless, you don't bring them in so that you can get them into heaven. You bring them in because they shouldn't be homeless.
Pastor of Grace Midtown in Atlanta, Georgia, Matt Reynolds.
We want to be a part of the kingdom that is building a culture that honors God and one another. Or are we just going to be a part of our own little kingdom, building our own little life?
And founder of Kensington Church, Steve Andrews.
People that are launching new initiatives, new dreams, new ideas, new ministries that are going to change the way people live.
We believe that you are the church, and it's time for us to move out. To register, hit up kensingtonchurch.org/moveout.
All those great speakers are going to be here at the Troy campus in a couple of weeks. I've already signed up. I invite you to go online or out to the lobby and join me for that. Also coming up in a couple of weeks, we're kicking off the next Alpha course. And so I've invited friends Cassie and Ben, who just completed the Alpha course, to come up here today and share with you why the Alpha course was so impactful. Will you give them a welcome? All right, so guys, you jumped into Alpha. Will you share with us what made you sign up for Alpha and how the experience was for you?
My wife. So we had a baby in September, and my wife wanted to have a New Year's resolution, which we don't normally do those, was to start coming to church and actually, as adults, choose to participate in our relationship with God. And our first service after the New Year, they started talking about Alpha. And we kind of had a little discussion after church, and we're like, you know what, if we're going to jump in, we might as well just jump in. Any of our concerns or questions, we'll ask. I mean, we'll kind of figure this thing out. We both have a background as Christians. My dad's a pastor, so I may not think that I'd have a lot of questions, but I do. But yeah, that was the most part for why we started.
Impact-wise, so the biggest thing for me that I got out of Alpha was prayer and how incredibly powerful it can be. We had a lot of financial struggles at the beginning of the year that were extremely difficult, and with prayer and going to Alpha and figuring out how powerful prayer is, on paper, it made no sense. We should not have been as calm and comfortable as we were, but I truly, genuinely believe that through all the prayer that we had with this, that is what gave us all the calm that we had through all the struggle that we were going through. Because it not only was a financial struggle, but with that comes an emotional struggle as well. So trying to kind of figure out how to handle that emotional struggle, we prayed, and without Alpha, I don't think I ever would have realized how powerful prayer really can be.
Thanks. And you guys also shared with me that you met amazing people at the table, and those not even at your table, who were there to give you wisdom and pray with you, right? So if there's someone sitting here tonight and they're kind of on the fence wondering, should I sign up for Alpha or not, what would you say to them?
Do it. 100%, because take out the whole like religious aspect of it. Like he says, you are going to a room full of people that just care about people. So not only do you have some really great videos and awesome food, but you also meet really, really genuine people through this whole situation. And it's just a great way to make friends, because we're still in contact with our table, and we actually signed up for the Bible class or the Bible study that's going to be starting when the next Alpha starts. And our table said, hey, we kind of want to stick together and kind of meet new people, but also continue those relationships that we had. So
that's great. Thank you for sharing. Will you guys give them a hand? So Alpha's on Wednesday nights. It starts on April 18th. You can sign up out in the lobby if you have questions, or people out there to answer your questions too. Finally, also next weekend, we are going to be celebrating baptisms here. It's one of my favorite services that we do, because just like hearing from Ben and Cassie, we're going to hear great stories of God at work in people's lives. And if you haven't signed up, but you're sitting here thinking, gosh, I want to publicly declare that I'm all in with Jesus, now is the time to do that. You can go out to the lobby, or better yet, go online, and we have a tutorial video that you'll watch that will answer a lot of your questions. And then you just sign up and show up next weekend, and make sure that you come. Maybe bring a friend, because it's a powerful service. Today, our speaker is Andrew Kim. He is our teaching pastor here at Troy campus. Before he comes up, let's all just stand up, greet a few people around you, and we'll continue on.
is a light. It burns brighter than the sun. It steals the night. Casts no shadows. There is hope Oceans rise and mountains fall, you'll never fail. So take heart, let His love lead us through the night. Hold on to hope, take courage again. In death by love, the fallen world was overcome. He wears the scars and our freedom in His name. It was swept away, He never fails. So take heart, let His love lead us through the night. Hold on to hope, take courage again.
And this song that we just heard, the title of it is called Take Heart. And the inspiration for the song came from Jesus' words in the New Testament in John chapter 16, verse 33, where Jesus told us that in this world, you will have trouble. And so He tells us that in our lives will not be pain-free. They will not be challenge-free. They will not be disappointment-free. But these things will enter into our lives, and we will experience storms in our lives, and He tells us that. But then He promises us something extraordinary, because He says that in the midst of that, you can still take heart, as we just heard. You can have courage, you can have hope. And the reason why we can have hope, the reason why we can have courage, the reason why we can take heart, Jesus says, is because I have overcome the world. And so for some of you here, I know that you are going through a storm in your life right now, where life is hard and those waves just feel like they just keep on crashing over you. And so today, that you would know, that you would remember these words of Jesus, where He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank You for this extraordinary promise that You gave us. That the reason why we can have hope, the reason why we can have joy, the reason why we can continue to love, that we can have courage, even when it feels like our world is falling apart, is because You have overcome the world. And that is something that we remembered, and that is something that we celebrated last weekend. That You loved us so deeply, so desperately, that You came to this world to die for our sins. And then You rose again 3 days later so that we could be free. We thank You for Your sacrifice. And we thank You, God, for what that means in our lives. That we can live lives of freedom and step into the life that we have always been created to live. Thank You that You have overcome, that You have conquered. And so we thank You, and we pray these things in Your name. Amen. And my wife, Robin, and I, we've been married for almost 12 years now. But very early on in our marriage, for 3 years, we lived in Minneapolis, which is the coldest place I have ever lived in my life. Anyone actually from Minnesota here? Anyone? Oh, a few people are. So you understand how cold it is. The people there are wonderful, but I am not kidding you. It is cold. And so for those 3 years that we lived there, I worked at a college as a resident director, meaning my wife and I, we lived in the dorms with the students, and really we did life with them. And it was a fantastic job during that season of my life. And during those 3 years, my wife went to school for her master's in marriage and family therapy, which is basically the reason why we moved there. But in the final year of her program, I started applying for church jobs all across the country because long term, I didn't want to be in higher education, but rather I wanted to work in the church. And if you know anything about the church, you know that some churches are slow when it comes to the hiring process. And so knowing this, I started sending out my resume. I started applying for positions at least a year before I knew I needed a job. But what made things a little bit complicated at the time was that my job at the college required me to give 5 months notice. Meaning in January, I had to tell my boss whether I would be coming back for the following school year. And if I chose not to, I would still have to work until the end of June. And of course, our housing was also tied to my job. So come July, if I didn't have another job, we also wouldn't have a place to live. And sort of to top it all off, my wife was pregnant with our first child, Eliana, and she was due in early August. And so at the time, I felt an immense amount of pressure to find another job by July so I could not only support my family so we could have health care, but also so we could move to wherever we needed to move, get settled before our baby finally came. But I remember it was March of that year. In March of that year, I remember I had absolutely nothing. No prospects, nothing. The only thing that I had was a big pile of emails in my inbox that said from churches, Andrew, we think you're great, just not great for us. Had a lot of those emails, read a ton of them. And so in March of that year, I remember I hit rock bottom. I lost all hope, and I was so angry, and I was so frustrated. I had already quit my job, and I was thinking there is no chance that anyone is going to hire me in the next 3 months. And so for my wife, Robin, we talked and we formulated a plan. And we said, hey, you know what? Come July, in a few months, what we're going to do, let's just put all of our things into storage. And we'll go move in with my parents. This is Robin. We'll go move in with my parents. And Robin's parents, at the time, they were living 3.5 hours north of Minneapolis. And so I was thinking, you know what? At 31 years old, and with a baby on the way, I am going to be unemployed and living in my in-laws' basement. Life doesn't get any better than that. This is the crowning achievement of my life. But I can tell you that during that time, especially in that month, I felt like a total failure. I felt like a failure as a husband, as a father, and as a man. Because I looked at my family and I said, I cannot do anything. I can't support you. I felt like a total failure. And God did eventually give me a job. But during that season, I was so angry at him. And I would ask him every single day questions like, what are you doing, God? Why are you allowing this to continue to happen? Don't you see that I need a job? And it's not like I want to be a millionaire. All I want to do is to be able to support my family. And I asked him questions like, do you even care? Do you even see what I'm going through? And do you care about what I'm going through? Ever asked questions like that? Ever experienced a storm like that, where you ask those questions of God? And today, we're going to be starting a brand new series titled Riding the Storm, where over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be leaning into many of these questions by looking at 4 stories from the Apostle Paul's life in the New Testament. And when we look at Paul's life, what we see is that Paul went through more than his fair share of difficulties, of pain, and of heartbreak. Yet he lived an incredible life for God. And what we're going to see, and one of our hopes is, as we go through this series and we look at his life, is our hope is that what Paul learned from his experiences would encourage and challenge us to also trust and lean into God in our most difficult and in our darkest moments. And in the story that we're going to be looking at today, what we see is that Paul was in a really, really difficult situation. And just to give you a little bit of a backstory as to what was going on in Paul's life, in the few years previous when we're actually going to be picking up the story, Paul had been arrested in Jerusalem. And then he had been transported, taken to a nearby city called Caesarea, where he had been under house arrest for 2 long years. And now he was being transported from Caesarea all the way over to Rome to have his case heard by Caesar. And when we pick up the story, what we see is that Paul had been traveling for more than a week. Some people believe that it was about 2 weeks that he had been traveling. He had been sailing. And he had sailed from this place called Caesarea to a town called Fair Havens, which was on the island of Crete, the Greek island of Crete. And when we pick up the story, we find that it was early October, which was considered to be a very dangerous time to sail because the conditions could change very, very quickly. And so Paul, knowing this, he went to the people in charge and he recommended that they stop sailing for the winter, that they stay in this town called Fair Havens on the island of Crete, and then start sailing again in the spring. And so this is what Paul said. We're going to pick it up in Acts chapter 27, starting in verse 10. And Paul says, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Which makes sense, because it's not like Paul was a maritime expert, and these other 2 men were. And so then it says, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was the harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. And so Phoenix was on the southwest portion of the island of Crete, and so they decided that they would keep sailing. And when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. So they decided, rather than to stay where they were, we're going to keep going a little more, and then we'll stop there for the winter. And when they started moving, it looked like the conditions were perfect. There was a gentle wind moving them along the island, along the coast of Crete, to their final destination. And so it looked like the pilot and the owner of the ship had been right, and Paul had been wrong. But if you look at verses 14 to 20 in Acts chapter 27, what you see is that the conditions suddenly changed. Because as I mentioned, it was early October, which was considered to be a very dangerous time to sail, because the conditions could change very quickly. And they did. And they started off in this sort of gentle wind. But then suddenly things changed, and they found themselves in a full-blown hurricane. And as we'll see later on, they were in this hurricane for 2 long weeks. For 14 days, they were in this hurricane. And this hurricane was so fierce, it was so violent, that they eventually lost all control. They couldn't control their speed, they couldn't control their direction, and they were at the mercy of this storm. And so this is what it says in verse 20, when they were in this storm. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging. It just kept going. It would not stop. And maybe for some of you here, you're in a storm, and it feels exactly like this. The storm keeps raging. It feels like wave after wave keeps pounding you, and it just isn't stopping. This is what Paul was experiencing. And so these words are so powerful. Because it says, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. The storm was so violent, so ferocious, that eventually they said, there is no hope. We are not going to make it through. And everyone on board that ship felt this way, including Paul. Paul, the man who wrote a huge portion of the New Testament. Paul, the man who had this incredible faith. He lost all hope as well of being saved. And I love that the scriptures include this, because it shows Paul's humanity. Because Paul wasn't a perfect human being. He wasn't Jesus. He was a regular person like you and me who put his pants on one leg at a time. And so it said that in this storm, Paul lost all hope of being saved. Ever felt like that in your life? Have you ever been in such a ferocious and such a violent storm that you lost all hope of being saved? Maybe it was when the doctor walked into your room and told you those 2 words that changed your life forever. It's cancer. Or maybe it was when you looked at that mountain of debt that you had accumulated, and you thought to yourself, there is no way we're ever going to climb out of this. There's no way we're ever going to be free of this. Or maybe it was when it was that person that you love so deeply and so dearly was suddenly taken away from you forever. Have you ever been in a storm and lost all hope of being saved? Paul did in this situation. But then God did something incredible when we pick up the story in verse 21. Because it says, after they had gone a long time without food, and I love this part, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss." And again, I love that Paul says this. It shows his humanity, because remember, they're in a hurricane, this massive storm. People are freaking out, and Paul thinks, hey, this is a good time to say, hey, I told you so, guys. Remember that if you had just listened to me, we wouldn't be here. And it's so amazing that Paul says this right here, and I am surprised that these men didn't throw him overboard. But yet, we find that he just kept on sailing along. But then right after this, Paul encouraged them. And he spoke some incredible words to them, because this is what he says. He says, "But now I urge you," after he tells them, "I told you so, but now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men. For I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me.'" And so just when it felt like all hope had been lost, when they probably felt utterly alone and thought they were going to die, God showed them that he was with them. And this is true, not only for them, but it's true for you and for me as well. Because when we're going through a storm in our life, it's oftentimes during those times where we feel the most alone. But this truth isn't just, as I mentioned, for Paul and the men who were on that ship that night. And God isn't just with them. God wasn't just with them in their storm. But the truth is that God is with us in our storms as well. And this is the first of two truths that we're going to be looking at tonight. The first of two truths that we can anchor ourselves to when we are in the middle of a storm. Because when we're in the middle of a storm, we may not always see God, but I can guarantee you, and what the scriptures tell us, is that God sees us. Is that even when we're in the middle of a storm, it may feel like that God is a million miles away, that he is nowhere to be found. But the reality and the truth is that God is right there with us. And the scriptures tell us this over and over and over again. That nothing can separate us from God, that he will never leave us, that he will never abandon us, not even in a storm. And one of the places where it tells us this is in the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy. And Moses, the man who had led the people of God out of slavery in Egypt, the one who had parted the Red Sea, the guy who brought the 10 Commandments from the mountain down, he reminded the people of this very truth, the people of God, and that he said this: "Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord will personally go ahead of you. He will be with you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you." And Moses tells the people of God, God will always be with you. He will never, ever leave you. And when we realize that God is with us, it changes everything. Because understanding who is with us is so incredibly important. In this past week, I heard a story from a man named Craig. And Craig told me a story, and I heard a story from Craig about something that he had gone through in high school. And back in high school, Craig said, the meanest, the baddest, the biggest guy in his high school, and his name was Jerry. And this guy was a bad guy. He's like one of those guys who started shaving in the 3rd grade. That bad. And so he said that Jerry wanted to pummel him at one point in high school. And Jerry was much bigger than Craig. And the reason why Jerry wanted to do this to Craig was that Jerry, for some reason, believed that Craig liked his girlfriend, which Craig didn't. But this is what Jerry believed. So every single day, Jerry would stop by Craig's locker and leave a note on his locker saying, "The next time I see you, I am going to kill you." And of course, Craig didn't want this to happen to him. So what he did is that for as long as he could, he avoided Jerry like the plague. When he needed to go to class, he would take the long way around so that he would never, ever have to see Jerry. And he did this for a while. He was able to avoid him for a while. But he was thinking, how long can I keep this up for? But thankfully for Craig, one day, there was a boy, another student named Hank, who started at their school. And nobody wanted to mess with Hank. Nobody even wanted to be Hank's friend, because there was a rumor going around school that at Hank's previous school that he had killed another student. So people were terrified of this guy. Everybody except for Craig. And Craig went up and he became friends with Hank. And they became pretty good friends. So they would spend time together at school. They would walk together to class. And whenever Craig was with Hank and they saw Jerry, Craig wasn't afraid of Jerry. In fact, he would actually taunt him saying, hey, you want a piece of this? You want some of this? He would actually say that. And it's not because Craig somehow sprouted muscles overnight. But the reason why he had this courage, the reason why he had this confidence, the reason why his outlook had completely changed when it came to Gary was because Craig knew who was with him. That this guy, Hank, who was bigger than everybody in the school, who everybody was afraid of, he was with Craig. And so Craig knew that as long as Hank was with him, that nothing could touch him. It changed his outlook, it changed his attitude, it changed his demeanor. And it gave him courage and confidence. And it's the same thing with us. In the middle of the storm, because in the middle of the storm, when we recognize who is with us, it changes everything. In the middle of the storm, when we recognize that we are not alone, but God is with us, it changes our attitude, our demeanor, our perspective. It gives us courage and confidence, understanding that we are not alone, but the God of the universe is walking with us through our storm. It completely changes the way that we see it. This is the first truth. It's a powerful truth that God is with us in our storms. But going back to the passage, in verses 26 to 44 of Acts chapter 27, it says that Paul and those on the ship, as I mentioned, they were in this storm for 2 long weeks. And as I also mentioned before, they eventually lost complete control of their ship because it was such a violent and ferocious storm. They lost control of the sails, of the speed, of the direction. They were at the total mercy of the storm. And what ended up happening was that this storm drove them west across the Adriatic Sea, and they ended up running into the island of Malta, which is located off the southern tip of Italy. And they basically ran aground, and their ship crashed and sank right off the beach. But nobody died, just as God had promised. It was incredible. And in a moment, we're also going to see a video that was done by an interview that our lead pastor over at Birmingham, Cliff Johnson, did with a man by the name of Mark Gatt. And Mark, he was a rescue diver as well as an avid scuba diver on the island of Malta. And one day after there was a big storm on the island that basically had stirred up the seabed, Mark saw an old anchor that he knew had come from an old ship. But this anchor wasn't any anchor, because on this anchor, when he saw it up close, he could see the inscription of 2 Egyptian gods' names on that anchor. And the names were Isis as well as Serapis. And we know that in this story, in Acts chapter 27, that the ship that Paul was on, that crashed into Malta, that basically ran aground on Malta and sank, was an Egyptian ship. And this anchor was also dated back to the 1st century AD. And so although we can't be 100% sure that this anchor came from that ship, because it's not like Paul signed it and said, hey, you know what, guys? This is the anchor that was from my ship. That didn't happen. Because of the evidence that surrounds this anchor, we can be pretty sure, pretty confident that it did come from this ship. And so it is a fascinating interview. And while we're watching the interview, I also wanted to invite our ushers to come forward to receive our offering for today. And if this is your first time with us, let me first say we are so happy that you chose to be here. But this does not have to be your moment, and so please do not feel any obligation to give. Instead, what we'd love for you to do is, following this service, if you go out into the lobby, to drop by our Starting Point table. And you'll see the people at Starting Point, they have bright orange shirts with the word Starting Point right in the front. And we love for you to have a conversation as to how you can get engaged in our community. But if you give, we would just I simply wanted to say thank you for investing and believing in our community. So let's take a look at this video.
Well, hey, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. This means a lot to us. We're super excited to talk to you today. Can you give us a sense of when you knew that this discovery might be from Paul's shipwreck on the island of Malta?
When I've discovered the anchor and brought it up and discovered the inscriptions on it, because this is why this anchor is a bit unique. It has two gods, Egyptian gods, embossed coming out of the lead on each side, Isis and Serapis. This is a replica of a Roman anchor. The lead stock at the top is what is discovered. So in the case of the Isis Serapis anchor I found on the seabed, this weighs 1 ton. The size of the anchors shows that it was a very, very big ship, and by Roman standards, and we have to remember that St. Paul was on a ship that carried 276 men. We have this in the Acts of the Apostles. A lot of scholars and archaeologists believe that Salina Bay would be the shipwreck site, and that we have enough evidence now to prove that it could have happened in that area.
Can you give us an idea, what is the significance of Paul and his journey, and specifically this shipwreck, to the people in the island of Malta? Can you give us a sense of what that means to you there?
The shipwreck of St. Paul on Malta was when Malta sort of found its heritage. First of all, you have to remember that this is a tiny island, just 17 miles long by 15 miles wide. We have 359 churches. That's more than one church a day. There's a church per square kilometer, which is less than a square mile. So you can imagine how densely populated, how Christianity was influenced this country. When Paul came to Malta, it's not just Christianity that was made. It unified the country as a nation.
One of my favorite parts of your story is that at some point the Pope himself got involved. Can you tell us what happened there?
Pope Benedict immediately became very interested in it. He's a brilliant theologian, and very few know that he also is a keen archaeologist himself. A request from the Vatican that His Holiness would like to inspect this anchor. He said, "Is this coming from an Egyptian grain ship?" And I remember telling him, "Your Holiness, we can't say for sure, but there are the inscriptions." And I remember him touching my elbow and saying, "Yes, Isis." And I was speechless. It's true, the Pope did read the reports, and he did have a personal interest, and he did really ask to see the anchor.
Mark, there are a ton of skeptics out there and people who just aren't sure the Bible is true and really question that. How do you feel like this discovery would really help those who are skeptical and really aid in the validity of the Bible and particularly this story?
Skeptics will always doubt the Holy Bible. What proof do we have? When you weigh all the evidence, nothing compares to the artifacts that were found outside Salina Bay. And then when you compare those artifacts with what is written in the Acts of the Apostles by Luke and what was found on land, it all fits like a glove. It all makes a lot of sense. And we can honestly say that we know more or less what happened, that what is written in the Acts of the Apostles is all true, as the way Luke experienced it and the way he wrote it in the Acts of the Apostles.
Mark, I can't imagine what it must have felt like to make this discovery personally. So help us understand, what has this meant to you and your personal faith journey as you made this unbelievable breakthrough?
There's a lot to Paul that as such, bringing Christianity to us who weren't from the chosen people, and who brought Christianity to the rest of the world. And I got to admire Paul now more than obviously before, and obviously finding something that proves that the Bible is real makes a difference in one's life. The discovery has definitely improved my faith and consolidated more what I've always believed in.
Mark, we are so grateful for the time that you took to spend with us today, and we are so excited to see what happens with your documentary and the book that you've written, and we wish you all the best in the future. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share the story on the other side of the world in such a big country when we're so tiny over here. And God bless all the people who are hearing me, and God bless America and the Americans. Enjoyed doing this very much. Thank you.
It's a pretty incredible discovery that he made. It's incredible. Absolutely. And so it was, what he talks about, when I first saw that, it was just absolutely fascinating. And what he talks about is just, he discovered something that makes the Bible real. Because we believe that what the scriptures tell us happened to Paul. It wasn't just a good story. It wasn't made up. It's not fiction. But it actually happened during the course of human history. And what you just saw was just some evidence that supports it, that this actually happened. But going back to the story, what we saw was that Paul was now on the island of Malta, and that he had been in this crazy storm, and they had run aground, the ship had run aground, it had crashed, it had sank, but everyone had survived. And so he had gone through this crazy event for 2 weeks. And so looking at Paul, you would think, you know what? Things possibly couldn't get worse for you because you just survived a hurricane. How many people survive a hurricane and live to tell about it? Not many, right when they're right in the middle of the ocean. So you would think that things possibly couldn't get any worse for you, Paul. But they did, because he went through another storm. And this is what it says in verse 3 of Acts chapter 28. It says that Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, a poisonous snake, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. And when the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, it's an interesting picture of like a snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." And you read that and you think, are you kidding me? Really? This man just survived a hurricane. He comes onto a beach on a foreign island, and then he gets bit by a poisonous snake. And he's lying on the beach waiting to die. And if I was Paul, I would have said to God, really, God, what's next? Am I going to step on a landmine? And probably for some of you here, you can relate to what Paul was going through. And that maybe you were in a storm, and things finally felt like they were calming down. The waves were calming down, the winds were calming, and the sun was starting to come out. But then something else happened in your life, and you got hit by another wave, you got hit by another storm. I can imagine this was how Paul was feeling. He comes out of one storm only to enter into another, and he's lying on the beach, bit by a snake, waiting to die. But God, miraculously, he turned things around. Because it says, but Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was God. And so they were waiting for Paul to die, but when he didn't and he was totally fine, their opinion of him totally changed. Because at first they thought he was a criminal, but now they thought he was a god. And God used this to do something incredible in the lives of the people on Malta. Because it says, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. And what God did was he used this storm in Paul's life to bring healing to the people of Malta. He used this storm, something that was painful and difficult in Paul's life, to create something beautiful. And that is the second truth that we can anchor ourselves to. That God uses our storms. He uses our storms. And oftentimes how God will use our storms is in one of two ways. The first way that God oftentimes uses our storms is he uses them to draw us closer to him, to move us closer to him. And over the years, I have talked to so many people, I've heard so many stories of people who have said to me, it was in the middle of a storm where God got my attention. And it was as a result of that storm that I said yes to Jesus and that I started a relationship with him. Because people have said to me over and over again, before that storm, I was just living my own life and God was the furthest thing from my mind. But when that storm entered into my life, suddenly I started looking towards God and God met me in that storm. And I said yes to him. And that's probably, for some of you here, your story. That's where you met Jesus. Because that's how I met Jesus. It was in the middle of a storm. Because almost 25 years ago, I was going through this terrible time in my life where I was being bullied. And I hated my life. And I wanted to end it. But God showed up for me in that storm. And he showed me that he was real, that he was present, that he cared. And so I said yes to Jesus. And I said yes to following him for the rest of my life. And it changed not only my life, but also my eternity. And probably for some of you, as I mentioned, that's where you met God. That's one of the ways that God chooses to use our storms, by moving us closer to him. And for some of you, if you said yes to Jesus, something else that I wanted to also invite you to do, if you haven't been baptized, we'd love for you to get baptized. And as Nancy mentioned, that's going to be happening next week. We'd love for you to literally jump in the water next week and get baptized. And if you're interested in it, if you have any questions or if you want to register, we'd love for you to stop by the info center on the way out. And you can ask any questions that you want. You can register as well. And what baptism is that it's an external symbol of an internal reality. And there's nothing magical about going into the water, but it is symbolic of something that is extraordinary. Because when you go into the water, it is symbolic of our old selves before we met Jesus, putting that old self to death. And when we come out of the water, it's like coming back to life, entering into the new life that we have in Jesus. And next week is going to be incredible. And so if you are interested in getting baptized, we'd love for you to drop by the info center. But that is one of the ways that God uses our storms to move us closer to him. But a second way he oftentimes uses our storms is that it's through these storms that he helps others. He uses us who have gone through the storm to help others. And this past week was the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. And Martin Luther King Jr. was an amazing, amazing man. He was a man who had incredible courage and determination to stand up for justice in the midst of violence, oppression, as well as ignorance. And this past week, there was an interview that aired with his children. And the interviewer asked his children, if you guys could go back 50 years, and if you could change the outcome of what happened that day, meaning your father would still be here, and he wouldn't be assassinated. If you could change the outcome, would you do so? And I'm sure the interviewer thought in his head, you know what, of course they would do that. Of course the answer is yes. But there was a short pause, and then one of his daughters responded, no, I wouldn't change a thing. And the interviewer sort of appeared to take a step back because he wasn't expecting that. And then she said something that I thought was so incredible, because she said that it was hard growing up without a father. But seeing what his sacrifice has done to advance race relations in this country, she said, it was worth his death. It was such a powerful and moving statement, such a mature statement, that she saw this. that God used something incredibly tragic to create something beautiful. That God used this horrible event. He used it to be able to help so many people, not only in this country, but people all around the world. Because God uses our storms. He does, to help others. And for some of you here, probably all of you here actually, we've all gone through storms in our life, which makes us uniquely qualified to walk with others, to speak into the lives of others who are going through the same thing. And I can't tell you the number of people over the years that I have spoken with, and these are especially younger people who are being bullied. I've talked to so many people who are going through that or have gone through that. I've also talked to many parents who have children who are being bullied. And because I went through something very similar, I've been able to walk with them. I've been able to empathize with them. I've been able to speak into their lives and to be able to give them hope. And so we've all been through storms, which makes us uniquely qualified to be able to do that, to be able to help others, take what we've learned and to give others hope and to help them. And so it's two ways that God uses our storms to draw us closer to him, but also to help others. And so these storms, the storm that Paul went through, it wasn't purposeless. But in the midst of the storm, what God did was he revealed to Paul, I am with you. I have not left you. And that is a truth for you and for me as well, that God is with us. And when we understand who is with us, it changes everything. But at the same time, God uses our storm. That is the second truth that we can anchor ourselves to. He uses our storms. He uses our storms to draw us closer to him, but at the same time to also be able to help others. And in a moment, we're going to step into a moment where we are going to feel like we are in a storm. And we're going to hear it, and we're probably going to feel it as well. And if you're in the middle of a storm right now, whatever you may be going through, whether it may be a difficult relationship, maybe financially it may be really difficult for you, maybe it's a health issue, maybe it might be infertility, whatever it may be, if you are in the middle of a storm, this feeling will feel very familiar. But for others of you who are not going through a storm right now, maybe right now in your life, it's blue skies and calm waters. And if that is what you are going through, when we step into this moment in a little bit, what I would invite you to do is to think about somebody in your life who is going through a storm. Because I can almost guarantee that there is somebody in your life who is going through something difficult. And for you to be able to spend that time praying for that person. And then after that moment, we are going to sing a powerful song that's called It Is Well. And this song communicates a powerful truth that when we are going through a storm, the reason why we can say those three words, it is well, the only way that we can say those three words, it is well, is when we stop looking at the waves and the wind and the storm that's raging around us, and we choose to fix our eyes on Jesus. And when we do that, we can say those words, it is well. And so before we enter into that moment, let's bow our heads and pray. Jesus, we thank you for these two truths that we looked at today. That in the middle of the storms that we will go through in our lives, that we are not alone, but that you will always be with us. And we also thank you that our storms are not purposeless, but you create something beautiful out of them, and you use them to move us closer to you, but also so we can help others. And so we can love others and be a reflection of who you are to them as well. And so for the people who are going through a storm, who are in the middle of a storm right now, we thank you that you are with them. And I pray, Lord, today, that they would know that you are near, and that you would give them hope, and that you would also surround them with people who can help them and walk with them in the midst of their situation. And for those, God, who are experiencing calm waters and bright blue skies, that they would have the eyes to see those people around them who are hurting, who are going through storms, and that they would be a reflection of you to them and to love them well, God. And so we thank you for these two truths. Thank you for the fact that we are able to look at the scriptures and to be able to have a more accurate picture of who you are. So we thank you, we love you, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.
trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. And through it all, my eyes on. Every voice sing it out. Through it all, it is well. One more time. Through it all, my eyes are on you. It is well with me.
God, when we're going through storms, I know for me and probably for many people here, it's easy to focus on the waves that are crashing around us, the wind that is howling around us. But as we just sung, thank you that we have another option. That rather than fixing our eyes on those things, that we can focus, we can choose to fix our eyes on you. And when we do, we thank you that we can say these three incredible words: it is well. Something that is so counterintuitive, something that is so countercultural. Thank you that in you is found true peace, true comfort, true joy, God, true love. And I pray that for those people who are in the middle of a storm where they feel like, God, that they are going under and that they cannot take another day. God, I pray, Lord, today that you would remind them in such a powerful, tangible way that you are with them. And that we would choose as your people to fix our eyes on you today. We thank you, Lord. Pray these things in your name. Amen. Amen. And so if you're going through a storm right now, we would love, and you would like somebody to pray with you or for you, our prayer team is going to be down front. So we'd love for you to come down for that. Also, I want to remind you that this coming Wednesday, we're going to be having midweek right here at Troy at 7 p.m. Would love for you to come to that. And also, if you are interested in being baptized, stop by the info center on your way out. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your Saturday.
So